In today's episode of the Bilal Ware podcast.
When I see the efforts of some to say that you can't make a moral argument about slavery in Islam or attempt to normalize Islam, I reject it out of hand. It simply does not reflect the actual stakes of enslavement in the Sunnah, which takes us back to what Imam Fodio said at the beginning, that I cited at the beginning of the interview. This is the single most misunderstood element of the Sunnah. And if you study the African tradition regarding this element of the Sunnah, you'll understand why.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to this special series of the Bilal Ware podcast as we take a deeper look into the topic of slavery in Islam. In today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Bilal Ware, a historian of Africa and Islam and an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the author of several books, including the Walking Qur'an, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa, which we discussed back in episode 9 of this podcast. In that episode, we learned how African Muslims in the 18th century were pioneers in abolishing slavery and monarchy. I would recommend our listeners to revisit that episode as it adds some additional texture to our discussion of Islam and slavery here. Dr. Ware is an expert in the field and is the author of Chapter 3, Slavery in Islamic Africa, 1400 to 1800, in Volume 3 in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, and also Chapter 15, Slavery and Abolition in Islamic Africa, 1776 to 1905, in Volume 4 of that series. In this episode, we explore the Islamic tradition and the abolition of slavery, the so-called quote-unquote Arab-Islamic slave trade, and how these histories impact our lives today. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ware. Welcome to the Bilal Ware podcast.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. I'm glad we can finally make this happen. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. I've mentioned to many people in the past, like the episode we did about your book, The Walking Qur'an, was one of the very first episodes we did many years ago, and it's still one of my favorites, and also the favorite of many of our listeners. So it's great to have you back on the show. The series where we're talking about this topic of slavery and Islam. As a few background remarks before I let you get into it, when we talk about slavery in Islam, we start with, we look at the primary sources, which are the Quran and the example of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which, prohibit the enslavement of free people. It restricts slavery to, in certain circumstances, to war captives and born or pre-existing slaves. It mandates a clear ethical standard in the treatment of those restricted slaves, all the while stressing emancipation, not just even on an individual, but on a collective level. The Quran, for example, establishes in the categories of the recipients of zakah, this pillar of Islam, this mandatory charity, which is central to Muslim social economic life. It's the core for socioeconomic justice in the community, and the Quran indicates that those funds can be employed, by the state for the freeing of slaves, as it happened in some points in history, most notably at the time of the Khalif Umar ibn Abdulaziz. So many narrations of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and I'll just briefly mention two here, both which can be found in the collection of Bukhari. The first one, where the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, Allah says, I will be against three persons on the day of resurrection. And for the sake of time, I'll just mention the one relevant category here, the one who sells a free person as a slave. Very interesting. And the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is saying that Allah is saying this, in fact, bringing attention to the gravity of unjust enslavement. And then in another narration to complement this about emancipation, where the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, whoever frees a believing slave, God will free his every limb from the fire, as he has freed those limbs
of the slave.
The slave, right? So this connection, Dr. Ware, is repeatedly made in the sacred texts. This the liberation of slaves with liberating oneself from the hellfire. And so then, if we move on past the prophetic period, Muslim civilization after the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, in all its diversity, its regions, its peoples, there was this zeal for emancipation, which is consistently demonstrated. But the socioeconomic demand of the pre-modern world for slaves globally remains, and thus a move, to abolish slavery as a whole, that's something that doesn't take place until the late 1700s in Senegambia, which you detail in your book, The Walking Qur'an. So instead of fading away after the early formative period of the Prophet ﷺ, as we might have expected, it continued. And the typical explanation for this is that slavery just became agreed upon in Islamic schools of law as they coalesced in this early period. But this is challenged. William Clarence Smith described this as, quote, the fragile Sunni consensus.
Sunni consensus. Yep,
Right.
absolutely.
And there were scholars in the early period who contested slavery in Islamic law. So I want to begin there, Dr. Ware. First, of course, I invite you to make any introductory remarks, and then if you could expand on this assertion that's made of consensus on this.
Yeah, I mean, so the thank you for the excellent setup, because it's raised many issues that we'll unpack over the length of the podcast. So the first thing that I would mention is that the second of the hadiths that you cited is actually the epigraph for chapter 3 of the Walking Qur'an, which is a chapter entitled "The Book in Chains," which is about the abolitionist anti-slavery movement in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s. That ends not only by stopping the Atlantic slave trade, but by essentially effectuating an emancipation proclamation, ending the legal existence of the institution of slavery within a Senegambian Muslim polity. And so throughout this, I'm going to be drawing our attention to what West African scholars have specifically said about the prophetic Sunnah and the prophetic legacy. And the first thing that I'll say along these lines will be from a contemporary Senegambian scholar, great Imam Fode Drame, West African scholar currently based in Vancouver, polymath and all of the traditional sciences of Islam. And we had a conversation. He's somebody that I'm proud to say that I know well. We had a conversation a number of years ago, and I shared some of my writing on the anti-slavery movements in West African Islamic history with him. And he said, "Bilal, it's very important that you continue along with this work." He said, "This is the single most misunderstood aspect of the Sunnah." He said, this is the single most misunderstood aspect of the Sunnah. And when he says something like that, he's echoing a long tradition of West African scholarship that actually rejects the normalization of the institution of slavery in Islamic thinking. When one of the first examples of this tradition that I was introduced to personally is the great late 19th, early 20th century West African scholar, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba of Senegal, who figures prominently in my first book, the founder of the Tariqa Muridiya. In the oral traditions of the Tariqa Muridiya, with multiple, isnad, so it's a mutawatir in the oral traditions of the Tariqa Muridiya. There's a day where somebody comes to make their bayah, their njabalu, as it's called in Wolof, a submission to a Sufi guide. And in order to consecrate this occasion, they offer the gift of the most precious thing that they think that they can offer. They offer the gift of an enslaved human being to Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba as hadiyah, to consecrate this occasion. And so Bamba asks him, he says, "You own this man." And the man says, "Yes, and I'm giving him to you." And Bamba says to him, "Soko mome ya mom dahmag mom yo boko borom," which means, if you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master. And he pointed his finger to the heavens when he said the same master. So this is traditionally trained, not influenced by Western abolitionist thought in any way. Homegrown Senegambian scholar, never left Senegambia except when he was sent away into French imposed exile, who is saying God alone is the master and there are no slaves other than ibadallah, other than slaves of Allah. From the very same region that this very same Senegambian region where the revolution of the 1770s, 1780s unfolded. Another late 19th century scholar, Sheikh Musa Kamara, said that freeing the slaves was such an intense wish of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam that Sheikh Musa Kamara considered the legal abolition of slavery under French colonialism to be the fulfillment of the dying wish of the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam. And this is another classically trained scholar, not trained in any Western Western tradition. And it's because they read the Sunnah differently. And part of this has to do, I think, with the fact that West Africa was never incorporated into the so-called caliphates that really actually cemented the legal position of slavery in the tradition for many of the legal scholars, right? So the way that I've described the kind of transformation that you depict, and I want to come back to that in just a moment, is essentially slavery was a matter of customary law in all of the places that became the lands of the caliphate, and customary law ends up figuring in really important ways in all kinds of legal rulings. And scholars have to make categorical rulings that affect the status of free people or enslaved people or walid or mawali and so forth, whatever social distinctions exist within a society. It's incumbent upon scholars to make rulings that are applicable to that society. So therefore, in ruling on statuses that are extant in a particular society, one can walk away with the impression that just simply by ruling, one has endorsed the existence of that status itself. Whereas that is at best a tacit admission that this is the status quo ante. It's not an endorsement of the existence of the institutions itself. So Sheikh Musa Kamara, in his reading of the Sunnah, and he writes actually a full treatise on and he writes this in the early years of the 20th century, about essentially how he finds slavery as antithetical to the basic principles and the legal positions of Islam. He cites the case of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Khalifa in Islam, where it was said that in the military campaigns with the Persians, Sayyidina Umar would emancipate immediately any of the captives amongst the Persians who made salat. And they came to him and said, "Oh, Amir al-Mu'mineen, don't you know that they are just deceiving you so that you will set them free?" And he said, "Better to be deceived by one who deceives us in favor of God than to keep in bondage one who prays to him." And this goes to the core of the emancipatory message of the Quran itself. And the legal scholars spoke about this, wrote about this, right? Al-usul huwa al-hurriya. The principle, the fundamental principle of humanity is freedom, exempt from enslavement. And if you think about the Prophet's behavior, alayhi abdul salatu wasalam, at the siege of Taif, what does he do? He offers an emancipation proclamation. He says, those in Taif that are holding you in bondage, flee from them and you are immediately free. Why? Because people that are following an oppressive, non-Islamic Sharia, the fact that they call you bondsmen does not make you slaves, right? And imagine if this was the disposition that Muslim legal scholars had taken and had followed. Imagine if they had actually followed this constant Quranic call to emancipate the bondsman or the bondswoman, right? A call which is not echoed in the Bible, either the New Testament or the Old Testament. The Quran is the only of the Abrahamic faiths that makes the emancipation of people in bondage a principal meritorious act. Okay. And if you want to think about how this is reflected in the Sunnah of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, I remember reading this narration for the first time, and I wept when I heard it. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, this is in the Medinan period, he is walking and he hears screaming. And it is an enslaved man being beaten by that man's owner. The man is calling out for God. Ya Allah, calling out for God. And the man keeps beating him and beating him and beating him. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam gets close enough that the enslaved man now sees the messenger of God. And instead of calling out, "Oh Allah," he calls out, "Ya Rasulullah." When the man who was beating him hears this, he looks up and sees the messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there and drops his lash, stops beating him. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam says to him, he calls out for God and you continue to beat him. He calls out to me and you stop. The man said, Ya Rasulullah, I free him. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if you had not, the fire never would have freed you. So there was an understanding in the early days of Islam that goes back to that hadith that you cited, that leads the third chapter of my book, which is that to free a bondsman is emancipatory, not just in this life, but in the next. And unfortunately, the worldly preoccupations of what I will not hesitate to call imperialist slaving empires, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, with rare exceptions amongst their rulers, are imperial slaving entities and enterprises. So we should not be surprised that they reify this imperial institution, that the Romans had, drawn much wealth from, and so forth. But what's striking to me is that West African scholars, after the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, really starts to draw into like bold relief the absolute moral abyss that humanity finds itself in with this kind of slaving activity. How much has been lost and forgotten from the kind of ethical comportment of the Prophet ﷺ, that they return back to that initial abolitionist impulse and create the first, modern abolitionist movements in the world, to the point that the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, and I wrote about this in the Walking Qur'an, I wrote about it in a couple other places. I'm actually writing a book now about the revolution, just set apart from other narratives. The revolution in the Senegal River Valley between 1770 and 1806. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson, the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, credits Abdulqadir Khan, the Imam of Futa Toro in the Senegal River Valley, with inspiring him with the idea to create the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So that quite literally, the genealogies of modern Western abolitionism run through Islamic legal thinking. Abdulqadir Khan was a Maliki fiqh scholar. And he was rooted in and immersed in this tradition that saw the fundamental principle regarding humanity as being freedom, and saw only, and this was the position of Khan, this was the position of Bamba, this was a position of a number of legal scholars, is that only a legally constituted jihad waged by the Prophet, peace be upon him, or one whom he had deputized, so that's one of those four caliphs, was capable of taking a human being freedom away and reducing them to captive status. And that meant, for example, that it was only enemy combatants, that this was something that applied under circumstances of war and only circumstances of war, that it was basically, it closed down avenues for the reproduction of slavery through purchase, through natural reproduction, and so forth. And Musa Kamara's position, and I'll close, this kind of initial conversation here, was that if the Muslims had followed the Sunnah of the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, slavery would have died out within the first generation or two amongst the Muslims, without violating any of the property rights of the pre-Islamic society as it had existed before. Right? That the positive call to emancipation and the narrow window through which newly enslaved people could be produced would have meant that the institution itself would have ceased to exist, without, for example, creating the circumstances that obtained in Jamaica, where the British are literally paying slave owners for their losses after emancipation, or the way that Haiti, formerly Saint-Domingue, ended up paying the equivalent of billions of dollars in reparations, not for slavery, but reparations to their enslavers for the loss of their slaves.
You describe in some of your writings some of the different avenues that these scholars contested slavery in Islamic law. You mentioned one of them, particularly like the political legitimacy of the authority, yes. Right? That restricting it even to the Prophet ﷺ and the early caliphs. But it's also interesting, I think, also, if you could comment about the criticisms of expansionism, of even trying to limit aggressive quote unquote jihad, or trying to limit the many different levels of the production and acquisition of slaves, where the slaves are being produced, where the slaves are being acquired. Are they being acquired by Muslims? Are they bought from non-Muslims? There's so many different layers that I thought it was very interesting that many of our previous scholars, they looked at all of these different complex layers and sort of attacked multiple different avenues.
Multiple different threads. And I'll be blunt about this. When I first wrote the piece for Cambridge World History of Slavery, I'm thinking back. Oh, yeah, actually. I was with my kids in a line to go to, I guess it should be the Field Museum in Chicago. I was teaching at Northwestern. This was my first academic job, 2004 to 2008. And Stanley Engerman happened to be in line behind me, historian of Africa at Rochester University, happened to be in line behind me in the line at the Field Museum. And we struck up a conversation. I have no idea who this man is. And he finds out that I've recently replaced John Hunwick in the history department at Northwestern University. John Hunwick was a historian of Africa and Islam. And he approached me with the idea of writing this article, because Hunwick had recently retired. So this was 15 years ago. And when I started researching this 15 years ago, I very much expected to find the representation that had been given to me, through Orientalist literature, essentially, but also through a very particular kind of internal Islamic discourse that normalizes slavery. And it's just really, really unfortunate, that many classically trained Muslim scholars are unaware, right, that there is a tradition inside of Islam that is critical of the institution of slavery itself. So I expected to see, slavery normalized. And instead, what I saw was very much what Clarence Smith describes, a very fragile consensus, because people argued about literally every single element, right? So starting with the question of political authority and who had the political authority to take away a human being's life or liberty in the first place. It led to particular questions. Like, for example, you'll hear in much Islamic legal thinking, you heard this from ISIL, you heard it from Al-Qaeda, but you hear it from classically trained scholars as well, that there is Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and there is Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, which is the idea that you're supposed to be, that the normative position is that you are supposed to be in a position of conflictual military confrontation between believers and disbelievers, right? We're unaware that this was actually a discourse that emerged in order to legitimate the expansionist activities of a caliphate. Now, our Shia brothers and sisters were aware of this, right? Because they had sharp critiques of the way that Sunni authorities, constituted their intellectual authority. There's a kind of political critique there, but people don't actually realize that literally the term Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, occurs in exactly one hadith in one canonical collection without an authenticated chain, right? So this whole building block of kind of conflictual political relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, which is the engine that is driving militarized enslavement, it's a house of cards. It falls as soon as you literally pull the first card. So then get past the political position, right? In the 16th century, 17th century in West Africa, scholars are going back and forth all of the time saying, wait a minute, if you buy an enslaved person from a non-believing person, what does that even mean? How can that be something that is constituted as legal? And the position that they end up coming back to over and over again is, listen, that could be somebody's wife. And if that is somebody's wife, then you are engaged in adultery if you have physical relations with her. And it is your job as the purchaser to actually authenticate every single chain of custody, so that even if you take the position that disbelieving people can be owned and not everybody held that position, then it is your responsibility to make sure that you are not throwing yourselves headlong into a fire by violating someone's rights. So the point of this is that from every aspect, through the reproduction, the natural biological reproduction of enslaved people, through production of enslaved people through military activities, raiding and capture, through economic, it's what the French anthropologist Claude Meillassoux, he terms them the wombs of iron and gold, right? The way that that slavery makes new people, either through commerce, the womb of gold, or through war, the womb of iron. Well, both of these wombs were contested by Muslim legal scholars. And yes, it is true that because scholars make rulings about people of various statuses, you can come away with the sense that Islam is not challenging the existence of slavery at every corner. But in point of fact, there are Muslim scholars that are challenging the existence and legitimacy of enslavement at every corner, and they are crying out and saying that the basic ethics of Islam itself is that which Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba described, that if you own that person, then you own me too, because all humanity has the same master, and that only a very narrow, set of circumstances could ever preclude that. And for people like Bamba and for many others, those circumstances have not existed anywhere in the Muslim world for 1400 years. So there are no slaves.
Where the in your research in this, you've already described how a multitude of scholars were contesting all these different levels of slavery.
Yep.
Because certainly when you look at history, there's like this big hole from like 700 to 1700, and as a Muslim, you're wondering like, okay, what was going on in this period? Because it just seems like slavery was just perpetuated. Were these scholars limited to scholars in West Africa, or did you find also other scholars in the other lands of Islam who were also voicing some, objections? Now, certainly in those lands, as you've described, if I can use what you quoted, functionaries in expansionist slave states is
Yes,
a phrase you used in your book, which is certainly very true. But were there other dissenting voices in these expansionist empires?
Absolutely. There were other dissenting voices. I mean, it's one of the things I think that you and I mean, having talked about this offline, you and I agree that there are points at which, Clarence Smith, William Gervais Clarence Smith's book is more evocative than kind of dispositive, right? That he points to interesting directions and doesn't always carry his case through. Having said that, you do see positions that are very, very similar to the ones that I'm describing amongst West African scholars showing up in Malaysia and Indonesia and in the Indian Ocean Muslim world. And so this is one of those places where arguments from silence are always dangerous, right? When you presume that because you haven't yet seen the evidence of a thing, that the thing isn't there. Historians are taught to never make arguments from silence because you're only a smart dissertation away from having your argument blown up when somebody finds the evidence. And I think that there are pieces of evidence of this kind of critical position regarding enslavement that show up all throughout the Muslim world. And I think, to be perfectly honest, that there has been a kind of collusion between so-called fundamentalist Muslims and Orientalists in normalizing slavery as part of the basic legacy of Islam, right? It's not an accident that, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are passing around concubines, right? They in the world that they've constructed, this is an authentic part of the militarized tradition of Islam. And that is something that those debauched and misguided organizations, they are reinforced in that view by an Orientalist depiction of Islam that also seeks to tether slavery and Islam, as though the two are organically connected. Now, what's interesting about this is that argument from the Orientalists is actually a relatively recent argument. In the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, many Western scholars would juxtapose the overall kind of emancipatory ethos and the one believer before one God of Islam with Christendom, and would use Islam as a kind of rhetorical device in order to critique oppression within Western societies. Okay, there's a lot of that kind of Islamophilia which if you're not familiar with it, you're going to think that there's just kind of a straight line between the Crusaders and 19th century and imperialism. But in point of fact, there's actually a lot of twists and turns in that, right? That have to do with, the representation of Muslims as, bringing humanity and Europe out of the Dark Ages, about, a kind of indebtedness to Muslim philosophers and scientists, and thinking of Islam essentially as a progressive tradition, to borrow today's, lingo. Well, that ambivalence, right? Because there is a demonization of Islam, there is a medieval harem, stereotype. There's an ambivalence in Western Europe about how to present Islam, but you can draw on kind of either piece. That disappears with 19th century imperialism. And portraying Muslims as people who are religiously committed to the perpetuation of enslavement becomes a principal argument for European imperialism in both the Middle East and especially in East Africa, right? They literally say we have to go in and end the grip of the cruel Arab slavers over the African, continent, and Africans become, sort of docile, passive sufferers of Arab, imperial enslaving exploitation, and the Europeans are going to come, in riding on white horses and set the Africans free. Now, the argument is nonsense, right? On the face of it. The Europeans are fresh off of conducting the largest slave trade ever operated in human history. And now they're telling you with a straight face that they invented freedom and that they're going to bring it to everybody in the world. And it gives them no pause, but it is actually quite literally used as a justification for European imperial expansion. So this idea that slavery is just naturally part of Islam as a religion, and Islam, kind of sanctifies it and preserves it, is something that is very much part of the 19th century European imperialist project in Africa and in the Middle East.
Yeah, I definitely want to revisit this topic about, when we get into sort of the quote unquote Islamic slave trade, because this connects with it.
Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of stuff on that. Yeah.
Yeah, before we get into that, I do want to revisit, again, I'll direct our listeners to our previous episode where we went in detail about, in the book, The Walking Qur'an. But I do want to revisit, what happened in Senegambia in the late 1700s, which, as you pointed out, this was the first movement of abolitionism that actually inspired the European abolitionist movement as well. But, I think we've sort of laying a groundwork, but by that, this couldn't have happened in a vacuum. And I think you've sort of hinted that basically that this tradition of scholars over time contesting slavery and Islamic law over a period of time, that this didn't just occur out of nowhere, what happened in Senegambia. So I like to sort of just, if you could sort of revisit that, share some insights, perhaps maybe some new insights you've had about this vis-a-vis slavery, to our listeners today.
Yeah, I mean, there is very much a lively discourse. It starts. I'll paint the intellectual genealogy in this way. The first group of people in African history to be enslaved on any kind of substantial scale are not Black people. They're Amazigh, what used to be referred to as Berbers, and this takes place throughout North Africa. And there's a lot of political critique that emerges about the illegal enslavement of Berbers. The rise of Ibadi Islam in Northwest Africa, and the fact that this becomes the predominant form of religious identification for most of the Amazigh population in early periods, is usually represented by historians as them taking objection with the enslaving activities of the Sunni authorities that established themselves. So they accept Islam, but they take a sectarian, position of difference. So the reason why I'm pointing to that is that takes us back into the, 800, 900, 1000 CE. There's already a kind of disposition of resistance. And you see amongst North African scholars, the seeds of what will become a kind of mature abolitionism in West African history in the 1500s and 1600s. So there's a scholar called Alwan Sharisi, who in the 1400s, I think that he's Moroccan or perhaps Tunisian, but he's from Northwest Africa. He writes in the 1400s, he says, how is it that the kalima, how is it that the testification of faith that sets someone free in the next life does not shield them from the indignities of enslavement in this one? Powerful question, right? Powerful question. And it goes back to that, Quranic call, and that call from the Sunnah is that if the believers are your brothers and sisters, set them free. That there's few things that are more meritorious than freeing the bondsman or the bondswoman. So there's hints of this already. When the slave trade begins to gather steam, and it's important to recognize that, like, there isn't a substantial slave trade from sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa until the European slave trade from Africa is already established. And this is a very common misconception. And we'll get there, I presume, in a minute, because we've talked about, leading to this later. But a lot of the so-called Arab slave trade is really just the Atlantic trade expanding into new markets in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. But the reason why I want to just focus quickly on Northwest Africa is that even in Northwest Africa in the 1500s and 1600s, when there are incidents of illegal enslavement, a Moroccan sultan in the 1670s tries to enslave all the free Black population and says, well, if they're Black, they're just slaves. So I don't need a certificate of purchase. Then there are literally scholars that are martyred.
Yeah.
Martyred, protesting these kind of flagrant abuses of Islamic law. So I don't want to paint the resistance to this as just being a sub-Saharan African phenomenon. It's just that it becomes most pronounced and visible in history in sub-Saharan West Africa, because nowhere in space or time is a Muslim population more ravaged by enslavement than West Africa at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. So it makes a lot of sense that West African Muslim scholars are going to push this inherent abolitionism in Islamic legal thinking to its logical political conclusions, religious conclusions, spiritual conclusions even, right? That you could think of freeing all these people as expiation of the sins of your ancestors who participated in the trade. So that's one part. Then by the 1500s in Timbuktu, you see this very, very clearly, right? The antecedents of what is going to become a strong critique in later periods. The political movement that leads to the revolution in the Senegal River Valley in the 1700s really starts in the 1550s, because what happens is that as the Atlantic slave trade creates a market for human beings as capitalist commodities, something that had never existed in any trade, right? Previously, it warps many elements of even that capitalist enslavement. It shuts down lots of avenues towards liberation. It changes people into products in ways that earlier forms of enslavement didn't. So the first thing that happens is that West African political institutions try to respond by getting rid of the despotic rulers that are being foisted upon them by European trading partners. How basically, like, the way that the West functions now, its imperialism functions through regime change, right? We're going to assassinate rulers that don't give us the raw materials that we want from a particular part of the world, and we are going to install rulers rulers that will do so, or we're going to preserve chaos and destabilization that allows us to extract resources at low cost. Well, that was pioneered with the slave trade in West Africa in the 1500s. Africans resisted. They were assassinated, replaced with warlord kings that would trade with the Europeans, or the region was just destabilized. Chaos was sown because then every single military conflict would produce captives that now had cash value. So you destabilize the entire region so that you can extract the resources that you want from it. So the first response from Muslim West Africans isn't an Islamic response, it's a political response. In Senegambian society, and Senegambia is the first region that gets exposed to European influence. Europeans arrive in the mouth of the Senegal River in the 1440s, right? And by the 1500s, the slave trade is beginning to pick up pace. The 60% of the enslaved in New Spain, in what's now Mexico, in the 1500s, middle years of the 1500s, are either Wolof or Fulani, according to Spanish records, right? So you have the predominant Muslim ethnic groups of Senegambia. You can see that their society is being ripped apart because they are now turning up in big numbers in places like Mexico City and in the Andes. Now, there's a political response. Essentially, the traditional institutions of representative democracy try to respond by throwing out these despotic kings. But these despotic kings have made a move that sort of checkmates the old political authorities. They no longer sell all of the enslaved to the Europeans. They keep some and arm them as personal guards and retainers, their own Praetorian guard. They're called Chedo in Senegambian society. And with your own personal military retainers, you can produce new slaves through your own raiding, not just against other kingdoms, but inside of your own. And you can punish any political dissident that would try to rise up against this new order by enslaving them too. So that's what happens in the 1550s and 1560s. And that's when Muslim scholars now begin to articulate a radical critique of this new kind of authority, because Muslim scholarly communities throughout West Africa had been understood as safe havens. So what you start to see in the 16th century is a lot of people who were nominally Muslim, but, Islam wasn't a huge part of their social identity, now are fleeing to go live in clerical communities, right? Submitting to the political authority of religious leaders, oftentimes Sufi sheikhs, because these are the only places that are safe from political violence, because enslaving scholars is like attacking the Vatican, right? Even Rome won't do that. So these are sanctuaries essentially for a new kind of cultivation of Islam. And it's not long before these sanctuaries, these Quranic communities, become places that start to organize their own resistance. So there are Muslim-led anti-slavery movements that, at least in this state of research, do not appear to be driven by the desire to completely abolish the institution in the 1570s, 1580s, early 1600s, but rather they appear to be interested in replacing corrupt warlord slaving kings that drink all day. I mean, they are literally, I've seen the customs records myself. They're literally trading Muslim peasants for bottles of rum. Actually, there are customs accounts where an interpreter will write on behalf of a quote unquote Muslim king in Senegambia that he wants 12 bottles of brandy in exchange for 15 Muslim peasants, and he's going to use the 12 bottles of brandy to celebrate the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. He wants 12 bottles of brandy for his Maulid celebration, and he's sending you 15 believing slaves in exchange. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi. I mean, so when scholars see this, that's when they start to develop an actual armed resistance tradition. And they try to establish new kinds of political authority. in the 1670s, they're actually briefly successful. 100 years before the revolution that I described in the 1770s, there's one almost just like it. And it's all over Senegambia. It's multi-ethnic. There are Amazigh, Hassaniya Berber, Arab and Berber scholars that are involved. Wolof, Mandinka, Fulani. It's not a national movement. It's a multinational movement to get rid of these slaving kings. And it's well documented actually by the slave traders themselves, because the slave traders themselves are furious, right? And what they say is that their goal was to replace the kings with burjulit, with Muslim kings. So everybody's nominally Muslim in the region, but these are people that are scholars, and the scholars are now for the first time trying to take political authority to try to put an end to this abomination of this slave trade as it has become established. What's interesting is that so they essentially take power for less than a 10-year period, and then they are absolutely eviscerated with punitive raids from the French and the British and everyone else, and a bunch of scholars get sold into slavery. But one of the things that's interesting is some of those slave traders themselves quite faithfully record the substance of the message of those religious leaders. There's a Berber scholar called Nasir ad-Din, who he's quoted by French slaving sources in that period as saying, they said that Nasir ad-Din told the people, God in no way permits kings to pillage nor make captives of their people. Rather, he enjoins it upon kings to protect their people. And the reason for that is that kings are made for the benefit of people. People are not made for the benefit of kings. Right. Beautiful, beautiful argument. Right? So what's taking place from the 1550s through the 1670s is an attempt to reform monarchical institutions to get them to perform more along Islamic lines by scholars taking the reins of the state. What happens in the 1770s that is so unique is that they say, no more kings. Kings are the problem. Slavery and monarchy are tethered together. And so there is a Republican revolution, one that seeks to create institutions of representative democracy and monarchy and end slavery all in one blow. And this revolution takes power in 1776, apparently a great year for revolutions, right? But whereas the American, revolution sells out on its slavery, the Senegambian revolution does not. Abdulqadir Khan, who Reverend Thomas Clarkson, hailed as the kind of founder of modern abolitionism, he said that the Muslim that should be protected from the indignities of enslavement is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if they pronounce it Ra iraha irara. So in other words, he's saying the formal legal protection that Islam offers people, I'm willing to extend it to anyone who will even pretend to be Muslim. You set foot in Futa Toro, you are free. Just as the people that fled from those that held them in bondage at Taif, when they reached the camp of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, they were free. If you fled slave owning and slave holding and slave trading powers anywhere in the region, and you set foot in Futa Toro under Abdulqadir Khan's control, you were free. And there are many sources, Clarkson, slave trading sources, European sources, oral traditions, Arabic language documents that all say the same thing, that Khan's Emancipation Proclamation was simple. For him, not even a single verse from the book of God should ever be held in bondage. Recite so much as a single ayah of the Qur'an and you will be immediately freed. Keep in mind that there are ayahs of the Qur'an that are comprised of a single Arabic letter. Qaf is an ayah of the Qur'an. So he's in Sheikh Musa Kamara, who comes from this region, who I mentioned before, who writes a treatise on slavery and its dubious position in Islamic history, right? Remember, he gave us the example of Sayyidina Umar setting all the captives free. Well, this is, I'm sure, what Abdulqadir Khan is thinking as well, because he's not reasoning in the way that is going to allow him to keep the maximum number of slaves. He's reasoning in the way that what is going to do the best work in the sight of God.
Right. Right.
And the best work in the sight of God is to shield as many people
Yes.
from the principal evil of the time.
Yeah.
So for him, sorry, and just so for him to he answers El Sharisi's question, right? El Sharisi's question is, how is it that the testification of faith that sets you free in the next life doesn't set you free in this one? Well, Abdulqadir Khan says no. In fact, it does.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, one of the ways you describe it, Abdulqadir Khan, like expanding this matrix of identity of
Yes.
that anyone who wants to be free, they'll be free. And so using whatever means to essentially opening up the realm of Islam to everybody.
What better dawah than this? What better dawah than this?
The way it's you know, when I hear about it, it's you know, these scholars of the religion who are not confining themselves to the basis of law as, you know, as you would find in the books, but as it is intended to be the floor and then to be expanded and elevated through the spirit. So as you describe, you know, using Muslim identity not as a sword to enslave, but as a shield. So expanding that, you know, that tent so that everyone who wants to be free can be free. It really, I think, it summarizes in a lot of ways the difference in outlook between the scholars who were these, you know, tools of political apparatus and versus the scholars of the religion.
It's a really important well, everything that you said was important, but that last point that you landed on allows me to introduce something in the conversation that hasn't yet come up, which is that Abdulqadir Khan himself was one of the most widely respected scholars of Maliki fiqh in the period before he assumed leadership in the revolution in Futuh. But what did that look like? So he has no state backing him. People come to him to have cases adjudicated with only his personal moral and spiritual authority as the cement, right, that holds the ruling together. And when I try to explain, people are like, what? Like, he's not backed by state power? And I'm a child of grew up in the 80s. So I'll tell them, like, the People's Court, Judge Wapner, if you remember, when they went on the People's Court, it's not the US government. This is not a real courtroom, but everybody that comes into the courtroom agrees to have that ruling be binding, right? Well, this is actually the default position of Muslim jurists in West Africa, because Muslim jurists in West Africa do not emerge as functionaries of a caliphate. They emerge as a clerisy, a clerical estate that is distinct from the political authorities. That's the reason why their communities often serve as safe havens. Even in the period of the empire, it's usually called the Empire of Mali. I would really refer to it as the Federation of Mali because it's voluntarily composed. It's not established, most of it through conquest. But in the height of the Federation of Mali in the 1300s, they said that if you reached the city of Jaga, and Jaga was this kind of archetypal clerical community, the Jahanke scholars, Imam Fodio, who I mentioned himself, is a Jahanke scholar. They're often understood to be the first clerical specialist, first scholarly specialist in West Africa. So if you reach their hometown, the town of Jaga, the text, the Tarikh al-Sudan, the history of the lands of the blacks, says that anyone that reached the town of Jaga was exempt from any kind of political persecution or oppression. Even if you had killed one of the king's own sons, he could not claim blood money. They called it the city of God. So the idea is that rather than emerging as functionaries who fulfilled the whims of a political state, these were this was a distinct class of scholars whose job was to teach and to provide, spiritual guidance, and they would do they practiced jurisprudence on the basis of their scholarly and spiritual authority, not on the basis of force of arms and being backed by the state. And so it's very, very it's a very different model of the articulation between religious authorities and political authorities than that which obtained in the so-called heartlands of Islam.
Our listeners can revisit that episode where we talk in detail about
Yes,
Senegambia.
yeah,
But
yeah.
as you described in your book, The Walking Qur'an, there's multiple times where slavery is essentially abolished, and then but certainly, and I think this ties to the question that we want to, or the issue we want to revisit, which about this slave trade,
Yeah.
the pressures on Senegambia, like as you hinted at earlier, everybody is involved with slavery around them, right? And so
Yes.
I think you describe, if you didn't enslave people, your enemies did, and they're going to
Yep.
come after you and make you slaves.
Yeah.
So eventually this period ends. The Imam is actually assassinated if
In
I
1806,
remember
that's correct. Yeah, you do remember correctly.
and then people retreat back to their just the fragile consensus, if you want to
Yep.
call that, and slavery, it comes back. Like, if you could comment a little about this and then tie that into, because this is obviously because of the global pressures of the slave trade, which is, as
Yep.
you mentioned, the Atlantic slave trade. Speak about the end of this period. Is this just a blip in history? And why focus on this point, and then tie it also into the question which we want to revisit about this myth of the quote unquote Islamic slave trade.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's such a really important point. It's not just like a passing blip in history, because the success of the revolution in Senegambia, I mean, this is a 30-year period. Like, imagine a 30-year period where, like, let's just take the Congo, for example, right? The Congo is the source of, it's the largest source of mineral wealth on the African continent, with the possible exception of South Africa. Most of our cobalt and coltan and all of these other resources, and the Congo is systematically destabilized to allow us to extract those resources. Well, what if someone came to power in the Congo and kicked all extracting Western authorities out for a 30-year period? Even if that came back, it would be more than just a blip, right? It would be significant. It would be powerful. And in point of fact, that's exactly why the CIA assassinated Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, was because Patrice Lumumba was threatening to do exactly that. So the first thing to say is, even from the standpoint of Senegambian history and broader global history, an African Muslim abolitionist movement that is successful for 35 years, even if it is then overturned, is still significant. And in point of fact, it ends up leading to the creation of the largest territorial state in West African history, because people forget that Uthman Dan Fodio, the creator of the so-called Sokoto Caliphate, is also Fulani. He comes to power 20 years after Abdulqadir Khan's revolution. Indeed, before Khan's assassination, he's from the same ethnic group, the same political and clerical class. The revolution has now been transported essentially to Nigeria. Uthman Dan Fodio's position is he fights against the slave trade. It's not clear that he seeks to abolish slavery the way that Khan does. He seems to be, as politically radical, but perhaps not as juristically, radical, or perhaps the circumstances were different. And also, it's possible that Dan Fodio's own position was more radical, and later scholars, interpretation of that legacy becomes more reactionary. But in any case, everyone acknowledges the significance and importance of Sokoto. People don't remember. There was a Western scholar, Humphrey Fisher, who in an article in 1987 wrote about Uthman Dan Fodio a piece. He called it "The Muslim Wilberforce: The Sokoto Jihad as Anti-Slavery Crusade." And it's now, I'm hearing this now for the first time in my own head. Yeah, Clarkson, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, was the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of Slave Trade. Wilberforce is, of course, usually given credit for lobbying the British Parliament to lead to abolition in 1807. So Wilberforce gets all the love and all the credit, but Clarkson was the actual founder of both, not just the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, but also the French La Société des Amis des Noirs. He was also the founder of that organization, the first French abolitionist organization. Long story short, Clarkson is to Wilberforce what Khan is to Don Fodio, right? The one is the forerunner. It's a smaller movement. It doesn't affect as many people. It's more radical, but it does lay the groundwork for what will eventually come. And then if you start to understand that revolution, then you realize that in the 1830s, Elijah Martal, who is widely, he's usually represented as the West African scholar who's most widely read outside of West Africa. He's one of the most brilliant scholars of the 19th century. State maker throughout West Africa. He's born in a village about 100 miles away from where Abdulqadir Khan was born. He's championed in the oral traditions of Futa Toro as the return of Imam Abdulqadir. There's documentary histories of him going and getting people that were enslaved in the aftermath of Abdulqadir Khan's assassination in 1806, and bringing back women who had lived in bondage in Bambara country in the interior for 30 years and bringing them back home to Futa Toro. So many of the most important political figures, people like Ousmane Dan Fodio, Elijah Martal of 19th century West Africa, are farming in the field that the Senegambian revolution cleared for them. And most importantly, perhaps, they export the revolution. The book that I'm writing now, I've been able to follow some of the enslaved lieutenants of Abdulqadir Khan in the 1790s to slave rebellions in Antigua, to the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution, to South Carolina, to Georgia, all throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. It's already been well known and established in the literature on Muslim slave revolts in Bahia in Brazil, that there was essentially a direct pipeline between the revolutionary movement in Ousmane Dan Fodio's region of what's now northern Nigeria, and the slave rebellions and revolts that were led by Muslim slaves in Brazil. So all of that is to say is that this is not actually just an over there in Africa story. This actually ends up leading in large part to the rise of the Haitian Revolution. It leads it's Muslims almost exclusively that guide the largest urban slave rebellion, that in Salvador da Bahia in 1834 and 1835. So this is a Muslim disposition towards revolution that is actually exported throughout the Muslim world. And I'll give you one. You said you want some new material that didn't figure in previous books. I'll give you just one example. In that year 1806, where Abdulqadir Khan is assassinated and the revolution is now coming under siege in the Senegal River Valley, I found a testimonial from Savannah, Georgia. Okay, and I'm going to read this to you. It's from a book called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. There was this a white evangelical who, before the Civil War, who was gathering up all of the self-serving white supremacist Christian narratives and putting them all together in one book and saying, essentially, if you keep teaching Christianity this way, you will never make converts amongst the blacks. Telling them that they can go serve white masters in heaven if they serve them good here on earth, that's not going to get you a lot of converts. So he literally wrote a book called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. And in that book, he not only had like documentary things, but also sermons that he had heard, narration stories. He tells the following story, and I'll just read it verbatim. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, J. Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Muhammadan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties he must have time to attend to them. Mr. Doherty, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required, and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism, and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that.
SubhanAllah.
The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. So sit with that for a second. 1806, Savannah dock, a Muslim man is saying believers can't own other believers and their children after him. Well, where is he getting this idea if this fragile Sunni consensus is orthodoxy for all of the Muslims? And it's not, because in a place like the Senegal River Valley, they're saying we're all free because God alone is our master. And so the revolution is getting exported to the Haitian Revolution. It's getting exported to a dock in Savannah. It is becoming a part of African American religiosity and identity. To the point, you want other stuff from the new project. The most famous 19th century abolitionist in American history is Frederick Douglass. Many people will say that Frederick Douglass is the most photographed man of the 19th century, right? Well, Frederick Douglass comes from those same sea islands of Savannah and South Carolina, where I have been able to track dozens, if not hundreds, of people being enslaved in the aftermath of the revolution in Futa Toro. And it's the reason why we have so many Muslims, enslaved Muslims, popping up in that period of U.S. history. There's a more or less direct pipeline between Senegambia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay? So Frederick Douglass, his father, as we know, was a white man. His mother had the last name Bailey, which is a very common name for Black people in the Sea Islands region. There are no white Baileys in the Sea Islands, none. It's not a slave master name. And many historians have offered the suggestion that we have surviving Arabic texts written by at least two Bilalis in the late 1700s, early 1800s, right in the same region. But if you actually go into plantation records from their time, there's no less than a dozen Bilals or Bilalis that are in that region at that time. So historians have suggested that it's very, very likely that the name, the very common Gullah, Sea Island, South Carolina, Georgia last name, right down to the present, Bailey, is actually an Anglicization of Bilali, which would mean that America's most famous 19th century African-American abolitionist is likely descended from West Africa's most famous 18th century abolitionists. This is a living thread that becomes part of the cultures of the diaspora Africans. It becomes part of maroon communities in Jamaica. It becomes part of the Haitian Revolution. It becomes part of the resistance movements and rebellions in Bahia. So this is, properly speaking, like a massive component of the age of revolution. And it's been written out of the history entirely, right? To instead give a genealogy of liberty that emerges like Athena from the waves, right? Fully formed within the genius of white Western civilization. Whereas the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade is saying no. He says that Imam Abdulqadir Khan, what's his exact word? He says that this man has done more for the causes of liberty, humanity, justice, and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe. And the reality is that the persistence of this narrative that says that Islam never questioned or challenged slavery is a white supremacist narrative that has been doing white supremacist work. And Muslims have co-signed for this because Muslims do not know the African history of Islam. So we are reinforcing a white supremacist narrative meant to destroy us and to rob from us the emancipatory potential of our own faith. And we are saying, oh, well, because the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, owned people at point in his life, you can't say slavery is bad. Well, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, as Sheikh Musa Kamara says in his treatise, he died not owning a single human being. He liberated anyone that he had ever owned before he passed. We all say the tasbih of Fatima after our prayer. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar. Why do we say the tasbih of Fatima? Because Fatima went to the Prophet ﷺ and asked for a gift of a slave and he refused. Well, why did he refuse? Because he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was not seeing this as a morally neutral question. He was seeing it as a fraught question that had to do with the circumstances of the time. And he, as a prophet of God, given both the right and the responsibility to raise the sword under contingent specific conditions, was trying to shield Ahlul Bayt from the moral ramifications of owning another human being at that point in time. And when he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, left this world, he left with a clean slate in that regard and commanded his people to do likewise. And Sheikh Musa Kamara said, if Muslims had been serious about following the Sunnah of the Messenger of God, they would have followed suit. When I see the efforts of some to say that you can't make a moral argument about slavery in Islam or attempt to normalize Islam, I reject it out of hand. It simply does not reflect the actual stakes of enslavement in the Sunnah, which takes us back to what Imam Fodio said at the beginning, that I cited at the beginning of the interview. This is the single most misunderstood element of the Sunnah. And if you study the African tradition regarding this element of the Sunnah, you'll understand why.
Yeah. To echo what Imam Fodio said about this being such a crucial issue, I mean, you mentioned about the narrative that Muslims have imbibed and is pushed constantly. And I think this is why the topic is still very important, is that this narrative is always pushed, especially at times of new imperialism and anything
yes.
going on in the world. It is always, and we'll talk about this now, this quote unquote Islamic, this Arab slave trade, always revisited, whenever there's a new conflict that's being engineered. So, I mean, if you could speak a little bit about this idea of the Arab/Islamic slave trade.
It's really like, it's the most intellectually dishonest thing that I've ever seen. That's the first thing that I'll just say about it, because the truth of the matter is that it emerges from 19th century pro-imperial propaganda, and it's very visible to see this. Oftentimes, it's Christian proselytizers that utilize it and still utilize it, but it was also used as a justification, especially for the colonization of East Africa in the 19th century. It was a basic part of the intellectual rationale, was to say that the Arabs are cruel slavers that have exploited Africa since time immemorial. And I'll add on this particular point that as somebody who came to Islam through the legacy of Malcolm X, through Afrocentric literature, it's deeply disappointing and disturbing for me that a lot of Black scholars and so-called Afrocentric scholars also reproduce this Arab Orientalist stereotype about the so-called Arab slave trade. Dr. Sherman Jackson has written about it. He called it Black Orientalism, which is a beautiful way of glossing this problem. And the short version of it, to kind of make this clear is that in the 19th century, when Europeans were colonizing through the most brutal genocidal conquest that the African continent has ever known, they simultaneously developed a narrative that they're not the first ones to do it, that Arabs did exactly the same thing. And what they were actually doing was coming in to get rid of the oppression and the slavery that Arabs had brought, and they were bringing freedom. Now, we should have known not to take seriously a narrative that emerges from those kinds of sources. But because of the history of the spread of Islam through North Africa, which was associated with military expansion, a lot of people didn't know, in point of fact, that there were no armed external conquests of sub-Saharan Africa by Arab armies, not until 1591 with the Moroccan invasion of Songhai, which is almost 1,000 years after Islam had arrived. It's like 900 years after Islam had arrived in West Africa, you have the first external conquest. So there's this narrative, first and foremost, that posits that Arabs are European colonizers in Africa before European colonizers in Africa, and that the role played by Christianity in Africa and the role played by Islam in Africa are essentially the same. So the idea is that some of the so-called Afrocentric scholars, the Black Orientalists that Sherman Jackson names, they basically say, well, you're just exchanging an Arab slave master for a white slave master when you convert to Islam. Now, to the literature, right? Where does this come from? The earliest academic treatment, kind of serious academic treatment of the so-called Arab slave trade from the African continent is Bernard Lewis's Race and Slavery in Islam. You're shaking your head because you know who Bernard Lewis is.
It's the first book I got on this topic.
Right.
I was a teenager and I was given this book.
Exactly. And you got the published edition and the published version. And I read that published version. It was one of the first things that I read when I started the article that ended up being the Cambridge World History of Slavery piece back in, I think I started writing that in 2006, maybe 2005, 2006. Because, I'm a PhD in history and this is my job, not just to consume books, but to produce them. I didn't stop at Bernard Lewis's published book. I went and got Bernard Lewis's dissertation on the topic, the unpublished dissertation. And in the unpublished dissertation, in the foreword to it, he says the following. He said, in the 1960s, I saw Malcolm X as a profoundly effective and evocative proselytizer of African Americans. So I set about researching and writing this book to show that Arabs and Islam had exploited Black people just as much as Christianity and Europeans had.
Yeah, he said the quiet part loud.
He said the quiet part in the introduction. And thank you for that. That's exactly what he did. He said the quiet part out loud. Well, so just understand and that this was always polemical. It was always a divide and conquer technique that was designed to compromise things like Black and Palestinian solidarity, to compromise third world resistance movements led by people like Malcolm and the Panthers that were anti-imperialist and anti-white supremacist in their nature. And if you don't believe me, how is it used now? How is this narrative used now? It's used for exactly this purpose and no other purpose, because that's the reason why the lie came into existence in the first place. Now, it's important. This is not to say that there was no slave trade, nor that Arab anti-Blackness isn't a serious problem. There was a slave trade, and Arab anti-Blackness is a serious problem. But the arrival of modern Arab anti-Blackness is inseparable from the Atlantic slave trade itself. And again, this comes when you actually do the history. Because, for example, Egypt, I have Senegalese and Gambian colleagues and friends that lived in Egypt and studied at Azhar at different points in their lives from the 60s down to the current age. And they will tell you without blinking that Egyptians are some of the most racist people that they've ever encountered with regards to Black folks. Egyptian anti-Blackness is it's not Saudi level, but it's like really, really, it's really, really, it's close, right? Well, and we know that there is, a major history of enslavement between Egypt and the Sudan, and it's sometimes depicted as though that goes from time immemorial. So I'm a historian. I'm doing that first piece for the Cambridge World History of Slavery. And I can't just take the narrative. I have to see the documents. I have to see the proof. I have to see what things look like. So I start going back to 15th century sources before the rise of the slave trade. And the period that I'm covering in that piece is from 1400 to 1800. So I'm just doing my homework. I'm going back to try to find what's going on in 1400. The first thing that emerges immediately is that Blacks are a minority amongst the enslaved in Egypt in 1400. Not only are they a minority, they're not close to being the largest group of enslaved people in Egypt. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. If there's this slave trade that Arabs are supposed to be operating, and Egypt is literally in Africa, just north of the Sudan, why are there no Black slaves there? There's no West African slaves there either, right? So there's a very, very small number of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans in Egypt. Now you come back in 1600, Blacks are the majority of the enslaved in Egypt. Well, wait a minute. What happened in the meantime? Oh, Europeans created a global market for the commoditization of Black bodies, and Egypt tapped in. This isn't rocket science, but it's what we call back home. My father's from Georgia. I'm from DC, but I sometimes borrow his Georgia expressions. He said, this is what you call throwing the rock and hiding the hand. You're the one that broke it, but you put your hand behind your back so it looks like you didn't. The reality is that there was no major slave trade from sub-Saharan Africa into Egypt until the rise of the European slave trade from Africa. And then when you actually get into the sources, you see that a significant slave trade from the Sudan itself doesn't even start until the 1600s. It's actually like kind of secondary aftermarketing of European enslaved people enslaved by Europeans that are responsible for the first rise of slavery in different parts of the Muslim world. That starts in the Indian Ocean with the arrival of the Portuguese and their reorientation of the East African coast from something that traded luxury goods across the Indian Ocean to a source of slave supply. And they're actually the first people to do any extensive raiding of inland African populations from the East African coast. The Swahili never did that. The Swahili had been Muslim for 700 years by that point in time and had never been in relationships of war, conflict, or enslavement with their neighbors. The Portuguese come and start raiding the mainland for African slaves. They start buying. The only place where you can actually find significant numbers of enslaved people in the East African coast at that time is actually on the island of Madagascar. The enslaved population speak Malagasy. They speak a Malaysian language. They're not even what we would understand as Black people. So, and that story just disappears from the history because it doesn't fit the narrative that European imperialists want to tell you. Because in point of fact, they are basically responsible for the creation of the diaspora communities that now exist in places like Iraq and Oman and Saudi and all throughout the Indian Ocean world. All of that slavery is relatively late. And in fact, much of it is from the 19th century. Much of it, the actual explosion of large numbers of enslaved Africans anywhere in the Indian Ocean Muslim world actually takes place after the abolition of the legal slave trade by Europeans, because now the market forces push the enslaved into the Indian Ocean world rather than into the Atlantic world. So all of this is just to say, and I concluded that first piece on the Cambridge World History of Slavery in this way, if we were telling an intellectually honest story, we wouldn't separate the so-called Arab slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade. We would talk about the creation of one global capitalist market for Black bodies that develops from the 1500s on, that is an Atlantic project. It's driven by Europeans. It's even a lie, really, to call it Atlantic, because we call it the Atlantic slave trade, but actually a quarter of the European slave trade from the African continent was operated in the Indian Ocean by the Portuguese and the Dutch. And that gets left out of the count because it's not Atlantic, right? So the reality is that Europeans create a global capitalist market for Black bodies. And as various Middle Eastern and Arab societies get incorporated into that global capitalist market as client states, they too start to exploit enslaved African labor on a significant scale. And after the Europeans abolish the slave trade itself in 1807 for the English and the Americans, effectively for the French in the 1850s, in the second half of the 19th century, essentially the world's center of slaving gravity moves to the east rather than to the west. Mm-hmm. And so what we're actually seeing in the vehement anti-Blackness and kind of post-slavery racism in so many Arab societies is like the very last phase of the Atlantic slave trade.
Certainly an important point that you've made, that, you know, before the modern period, 19th century, whatever you want to say, overwhelmingly the majority of, before the Atlantic slave trade, the majority of slaves were not racialized as Black. It was something that, you know, where we are today in history, we look at what's most recent and that what's latched on. I think also
people remember the last thing that they see.
Yeah. I think another thing also that it sort of actually ties into the general narrative of the erasure of African Islam, you know, this idea that there's no Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, which of course is ridiculous. But then the fact that, okay, there's slavery that was going on, yes, in those parts, but those were African Muslims who were actually trading even amongst one another. It wasn't as if like the Arabs were going there and taking them out. It's just,
yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. I mean, it's one of the things that in that first Cambridge World History of Slavery I pointed out is like they create an export trade from Africa, when in point of fact there is a small slave trade that emerges, but it's mostly between Muslim societies in Africa, whether Black or non-Black. But that actually leads me to another really, really important point about the so-called Arab slave trade that I would be remiss if I didn't make sure that I mentioned, which is every single time that the estimate of the scale of the Atlantic slave trade has increased, they've increased the scale of the Arab slave trade to match it or surpass it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Which also shows you what this fake construct is actually all about, right? And it's based on the flimsiest of sources. If you go to slavevoyages.org, which is the most rigorous database for studying the European directed slave trade, the so-called Atlantic slave trade that we have, you can find like ship by ship record, how many enslaved people were boarded, at what point, where they were brought off, all of these things. And the current estimates of between 13 and 20 million enslaved Africans brought out of the continent through the Atlantic slave trade are based on this kind of careful reconstruction of as much of that data as possible, with their recognition that, especially for the Spanish period, a lot of there's probably undercounted, not very well documented. Well, when it's the so-called Arab slave trade, they'll say, I saw a video recently where some Black Orientalists said that there were 100 million slaves brought out of Zanzibar. 100 million, which would make it 7 times the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade, coming from this one tiny island, which actually only operated a slave trade for about 150 years. Well, that's the most insane thing that I've ever heard. But how do these kind of figures circulate? Because actual academics, Ralph Austin, for example, published an estimate of like 11 million for the so-called Arab slave trade at a point in time when the European slave trade had just been, set at 10.5 million. Well, when I went in to look to see the documentary basis, I was like, okay, he's saying for the Sudan, it's this many thousand. Well, what is this estimate based on? And I went back in and it was based on something that's literally called al-Baqt, the pact. Okay. The pact is something that has been written about by a number of historians at different points in time. It was a mutual non-aggression treaty between the Muslim armies and the Christian Nubians of Makuria, signed in 652 CE, when the Muslims were dealt their only defeat during that period. It's the reason why Nubia was not incorporated into the caliphate, because in point of fact, Muslim armies lost and they signed a truce, a mutual non-aggression pact. Now, in later years, Muslim authors would say that these Christians pay jizya to us of X number of slaves a year because we conquered them in 652 CE. Part of the imperialist, triumphalist narrative. The primary sources say the exact opposite, and you can still read the original pact. The original pact was they literally exchanged tribute, luxury items between the two states and have a mutual non-aggression treaty. So the estimate for the slave trade from the Sudan that appeared in the count of the so-called Arab slave trade for Sudan was literally just a multiplication of the number of slaves in this so-called pact, which was completely made up. And so on the basis of a non-source, historians were now saying 4,000, we can estimate 4,000 slaves a year coming from the Sudan. The estimate for the number of enslaved Africans coming from Ethiopia into the Indian Ocean world, and I cannot believe that this is true, but it is actually true, is based on a joke that was told to a European traveler in the 1600s when he visited a Christian monastery, when somebody was chiding the priests for their participation in smuggling children and said that you guys probably have 300 slaves a year that you come out of here. The person who did the estimate literally took the number 300, multiplied it by the number of monasteries, and said that there were 6,000 slaves a year going from Ethiopia into the Persian Gulf. What? You would be laughed off of the block if you tried to make that kind of argument about the scale of the Atlantic slave trade. And that just takes us back to the point. My dad, who was not an educated man, locksmith with a 6th grade education, but he told me things like, you'll never go broke telling white folks what they want to hear. If you say what white supremacy wants to hear, you can have no source base. You can speculate on ludicrous source materials. You can exaggerate wildly, and no one will ever check your footnotes. Because the Arab slave trade has to be larger than the Atlantic slave trade. It has to be older, because the only reason why we have a construct of the so-called Arab slave trade is in order to do imperialist work, is to carry water for white supremacy.
Yeah, no, this has been very helpful. I mean, I think to give some needed perspective about this Arab, quote unquote, Arab Islamic slave trade. As a final point of exploration, I want to go back to Muslims in history. Certainly we've talked about beautifully about this abolitionist thread and ethos of Islam, right? But if we look in history, as the Muslims are viewing history, one of the authors that you quoted in one of your articles was, when you look at Muslim history and slavery in Muslim societies, you have to look at it as an economic history.
Yep.
That sometimes they employed religious discourse to perpetuate this economic phenomenon, but it's primarily, an economic institution or socioeconomic institution, not a religious one, which I think probably applies to a lot of the history of slavery. But that being said, talking about today, all of us are products of our history, our experiences. We're tied to the norms, the values of the societies and cultures we're part of. Now as Muslims today, we have the Qur'an, we have the exemplary practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which transcend time. It's a source of divine guidance that can be applied as beautifully today as it was 1,400 years ago.
Absolutely.
But our reading of the Qur'an and the Sunnah, that is affected by the state of our heart, right? And that heart
and the state of our interests,
and the lens of our heart, it can be affected or affect the way we read history.
No doubt.
So when we get to the topic of slavery, as we conceive of it, as we understand it in our popular consciousness and our sensibilities today, it carries this weight.
Yes.
It's visceral. It's painful.
Yes.
And the fact that it existed in any form, regardless of how idealized you may want to make it, that the fact that it existed in Islamic civilization, I mean, that can be an obstacle for those who want to engage the Quran and want to engage the Sunnah, to be on that path of nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So
Yes.
my final question here, how can we reconcile this imprint of history on our modern day engagement with Islam?
So this is such a beautiful question, and thank you for letting us close here, because you've brought back out of me things that I knew I needed to say before we started. So the first is in Surah Hud, the Quran's 11th chapter, and in the 120th ayah, God gives us actually the primordial function of history itself. He says, "Indeed, in all that we relate to you of the tales of the previous prophets, with it we fortify your heart." That the function of history is to fortify your heart. The heart is the center of not just emotion and feeling, but it's also the center of intellection and understanding in the Quran. The Quran contains no mention of the mind. The Quran contains 200 mentions of the heart. And the thing that does the intellection in the Quran is the heart. So the heart is the seat of our feeling, our spiritual insight from revelation, right? But it's also the seat of our understanding and our intellection. What we know is properly rooted in our heart. And the function of history is to make our heart stronger, with a sound understanding, but also with an emotional connection, with compassion, and with opening to spiritual insight. We don't have a head-heart divide, even though many Muslims have made one, right? That's a Cartesian habit. It's not an Islamic one. For us, feeling and thinking are supposed to be located in the same organ. They're supposed to be located in our breast. So now, what do we do? How do we cultivate sound hearts? Because obviously this trauma and pain of slavery, especially in a world where all of our modern forms of oppression, exploitation, racism, capitalism, white supremacy are all tethered back to slavery. How do we fix our hearts when we see this institution being inscribed, almost like written back onto the tablets of revelation, that we're supposed to just deal with slavery as somehow part of the Islamic legacy? So the first thing is to go back to your first point, where you said we're all the products of our time. And that means that, yes, you can have heroes amongst the scholars of previous generations that were not critical of slavery or normalized it because they never imagined a world without it. And how am I able to reconcile that? Because I do not attribute to scholars an infallibility that is only due to prophets. I reserve the right to be critical of medieval scholars and to venerate medieval scholars, to have them as heroes that transmitted the tradition to us, and to have them be flawed human beings that were confined to the thinking of their times. Both of those things can be true. I don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So when I read in a Maliki text that a Black woman doesn't have to cover because she's physically unattractive, I throw that out because of the racism. I don't have to throw the whole scholar away. I might take seriously something else that they say, but I'm going to treat them as a human being, and I'm only giving infallibility to prophets who deserve it. And when you have that kind of critical approach to the tradition, then you can say that these people are products of their time. But the values and lessons of the Quran and the Sunnah, as you said, reverberate across time, transcend time, and new meanings are going to be discerned from those in every generation. And the truly spiritually sensitive, those with sound understanding and thriving, functioning hearts, will bring out that which is most beautiful in the tradition. Abdulqadir Abdulqadir Khans will come into being, who will see the tradition in its totality with their heart. And this is revolutionary spiritual activity. This was the work of people of tasawwuf, of Sufism, who were engaged in a jihad against their own ego, against their own interests, and therefore were capable of coming up with these novel, beautiful interpretations that renewed what had been a forgotten sunnah, renewed something that had been present in the early days of Islam, but was all but forgotten. And it's really, really important to understand that it is something that is in our tradition, but we must work on ourselves and we must work together in order to be able to pull it out. And I'm going to close with this example because I'll never forget, I was able to track Abdulqadir Khan's enslaved lieutenants to a slave rebellion in Antigua, and I was at the British Public Records Office in Kew when I found them, raising hell on a slave plantation in Antigua and starting a revolution. And I was like, man, they've exported this anti-slavery movement to the slave barracks. And I turned into the next dossier after reading an account where the last British governor to deal with Abdulqadir Khan in Senegambia had said, our relations with the princes of Fodio have increased greatly since we abolished the slave trade. This was after 1807. Since we abolished the slave trade, a trade which the princes of that country always opposed as being contrary to the laws of their religion. Mm. These were his exact words. So he's like, things are better for us now that we abolished slavery too. I flipped to the next dossier, and this was a British administrator corresponding with the Imams of Sierra Leone. The Imams of Sierra Leone were mostly from Fouta Djallon. Fouta Djallon had been for 2 centuries trading slaves with Europeans, without any questions about that. In fact, Elhaj Umar Tal, who I mentioned before, from Fouta Toro and kind of 19th century heir of Abdulqadir Khan's abolitionist legacy, when he passed through Fouta Djallon, he wrote a letter excoriating the princes of Fouta Toro for trading slaves with Europeans. He said, even if you think that you can capture disbelievers because they disbelieve and you can't, what gives you the authority to sell them to Europeans? I'll wait. Right. So he savaged them, for this when he passed through that region. So in that region, the British governor, Sierra Leone, I go literally from a dossier that's about Senegal and about Abdulqadir Khan's movement and how they viewed the slavery as opposed to the laws of their religion. I turn the page. And the Imams of Fouta Djallon are saying, Islam guarantees us the right to own slaves. You can't take it away from us. It's part of our religion. Right? And so that's to say that the tradition is a series of choices. Mm. The tradition is a series of choices. The tradition is open to interpretation. The tradition is open to manipulation by the forces of reaction and conservatism and empire and oppression. And the tradition is also open to interpretation that is radical and revolutionary and emancipatory. And a healthy, sound, thriving heart that has taken its place and dislodged the ego, put that tyrant in his place, and has become a humble servant, is going to have the inner discernment and understanding that is going to bring forth that which sets humanity free from internal oppressors and external oppressors. Because ultimately, that's how I read the Qur'an, that's how I understand what the Sunnah of the Messenger, alayhi abdul salatu wasalam, was, is that he came, peace be upon him, with the most complete set of armaments to free humanity from all internal and external oppressors. And subhanAllah, Sayyidina Ali, may Allah be well pleased with him. This is not from a Shia narration, it's from a Sunni narration. I saw it in the tafsir of Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, the great West African Sunni scholar. He said, no sooner had the light gone out of his eyes than hearts started to change. So here we are with our hearts in whatever condition they are, and we can either bring out that which is best and most beautiful and liberating and emancipatory and healing in the Quran and Sunnah, or we can use it as a weapon, a sword or a shield. The choice is yours.
I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, I think what you said it's in the last words in one of your chapters on the history of slavery, if I could just quote here, which I think summarizes what you've said so beautifully here. Muslims from the Cape to Cairo and from Senegal to Somalia found inspiration in these egalitarian dimensions of Islamic thought and practice, even as others sought to find in the Book of God ways to keep the naturally free children of Adam in bondage. So, as you said, it's about choices. I mean, You want to be an ethical Muslim, you want to be an emancipator, or you want to be something else.
That's it. That's it. May God give us freedom in this life and the next.
I mean, Dr. Ware, this has been a pleasure and honor for me. So blessed to have you come back on the program on this very important topic. May Allah reward you, may increase for you, facilitate the new the book that you're working on.
I mean,
we're gonna have to bring you back so we can get more juicy stories from your book.
I look forward to it.
But thank you again and for sharing your knowledge as a scholar of this history, of this topic of slavery and of Islam and West African Islam. We're just so indebted and grateful for you to join us. So I thank you again.
Thank you so much for making it happen. I really appreciate it.
Alhamdulillah.
I was able to see certain things for the book that I'm trying to get finished with a kind of clarity that's elusive sometimes when you're just hammering away at a laptop by yourself. Right. So thank you.
Alhamdulillah. So yeah, Jazakallah khair. And to all our listeners out there, Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you.
On the next episode of the Aman Wire podcast.
There's a whole small subgenre where scholars try to correct misinformation about Black people. There have been historically over time people who have written about this. And again, I mentioned Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who mentioned this in his book in regards to the weak and fabricated hadith. He clearly says every narration that disparages Black people is a fabrication, and this argument isn't just an Essendid argument. It's also like a Metin argument, right? Because this is beneath the character of El Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam to be racist. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one thing He praised him for was his character, but there also were times where scholars stood up and challenged racism, specifically as it relates to enslavement, and put themselves in jeopardy.